We think of war as something fought by soldiers on distant battlefields with tanks and planes, but what if the biggest war in history was also fought in kitchens, gardens, and garages? What if the most powerful weapons weren't just bombs, but ideas? Simple, clever ideas from ordinary people. During the Second World War, millions of people who never wore a uniform found themselves on the front line. This was a new kind of conflict. It was total war. It reached into every home, on every street, and when faced with shortages, danger, and impossible problems, civilians didn't just cope. They innovated, they invented, they organized, they created solutions that saved lives, fed nations, and ultimately helped win the war. How did a backyard vegetable patch become a weapon? How could a group of civilian pilots with small planes stop military submarines? And how did a simple act of mending a sock become an act of defiance? This wasn't just a war of armies. It was a war of ingenuity, and the story of that ingenuity is the story of how Main Street went to war. Number 17, how could fishing boats rescue an army? It was late May 1940. The situation looked hopeless. The bulk of the British army, along with French and Belgian soldiers, was trapped. They were pinned against the sea on the beaches of Dunkirk, a port town in northern France. The enemy was closing in. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, controlled the skies, bombing the beaches and the ships in the harbor. The large Royal Navy destroyers couldn't get close enough to the shallow shores to pick up the men. The pier they were using was under constant attack. The professional soldiers were stuck. The war could have ended right there. Then, a strange and wonderful thing happened. A call went out. It wasn't just a military order, it was a plea carried over the BBC radio waves and through official channels. The Admiralty needed boats. Any boats. Small boats that could get into the shallows and act as ferries, shuttling soldiers from the sand to the big ships waiting offshore. The response was immediate and overwhelming. It was called Operation Dynamo. But the people who answered the call knew it by a simpler name. It was the Dunkirk evacuation. From harbors and estuaries all along the south coast of England, a civilian armada set sail. These weren't warships, they were fishing trawlers, cockle boats, river ferries, private yachts, and pleasure steamers. They were the boats people used for a weekend on the water. Many were sailed not by naval personnel, but by their civilian owners. Fishermen, lawyers, factory workers, and even a few wealthy yachtsmen. They painted their decks gray, took on a few bits of military gear, and sailed toward the smoke and fire across the English Channel. One of the most famous was the Sundowner, a 58-foot motor yacht owned by Charles Lightoller. Lightoller was a retired naval officer, but he was more famous for being the second officer on the Titanic. He had survived that disaster by clinging to an overturned lifeboat. Now, in his 60s, he refused to let the Navy take his boat. He insisted on sailing it himself, with his son and a Sea Scout. He crossed the channel, evading air attacks, and crammed 130 soldiers onto his small vessel, which was designed to carry 21. He brought every single one of them home. This was not a safe or easy journey. The channel was mined. Enemy planes strafed the small, defenseless boats. The waters were rough. Yet for 9 days, from May 26th to June 4th, this fleet of what became known as the Little Ships of Dunkirk sailed back and forth. Historians estimate that over 850 private boats participated. They weren't just ferries. Many of them sailed right up to the beaches, took on as many men as they could hold, and sailed all the way back to England. They rescued soldiers who were standing shoulder deep in the water, exhausted and defeated. In the end, the effort saved over 338,000 Allied soldiers. It was a military evacuation, but it was enabled by a miracle of civilian improvisation. It turned a catastrophic defeat into a story of national unity and resilience. The Dunkirk spirit became a powerful symbol for the rest of the war. It was the idea that when faced with impossible odds, ordinary people could and would do extraordinary things. The rescue was documented in countless reports and later immortalized in books like Walter Lord's The Miracle of Dunkirk. It was proof that sometimes the most effective tool in a war isn't a weapon, but a simple fishing boat in the hands of a determined civilian. But even with all the stories, so much remains unknown. How many civilian volunteers who sailed their own boats were lost? Their names never officially recorded in the military annals. What psychological impact did it have on these ordinary men, who went from a peaceful life one day to a horrific war zone the next, and then back again? And in an age of hyper-specialized military technology, could such a spontaneous civilian-led rescue ever happen again? Number 16, could you really fight a war with a shovel and some seeds? By 1941, Britain was in a perilous position. It's an island nation. It depends on imports for much of its food. Enemy submarines, the U-boats, were sinking supply ships in the Atlantic at an alarming rate. Food was becoming scarce. Rationing was introduced for bacon, butter, and sugar in January 1940, and it quickly expanded to almost everything else. The government knew it had a massive problem. If people couldn't eat, they couldn't work in the factories. They couldn't fight. Morale would collapse. The country could be starved into submission. The solution wasn't a new naval strategy or a secret weapon. It was far simpler. It was a campaign called Dig for Victory. The idea was championed by Lord Woolton, the Minister of Food. The government urged every single citizen to turn any spare patch of land into a vegetable garden. This wasn't a suggestion, it was presented as a patriotic duty. Lawns, flower beds, parks, the grassy verges on the sides of roads, even the moat at the Tower of London were all dug up and planted with vegetables. This was a massive civilian mobilization. The government produced posters and pamphlets with simple, direct instructions. There were brilliant pieces of communication. They showed people what to plant and when. They gave advice on how to deal with pests. They created cartoon characters like Dr. Carrot and Potato Pete to make the message friendly and memorable. The radio broadcast gardening tips. It was a nationwide effort to re-educate the public about growing food. Many city dwellers had never held a shovel before. The ingenuity was in the scale and the psychology. It gave everyone, including children and the elderly, a direct and tangible way to contribute to the war effort. Tending a garden was something you could control when the world felt out of control. It connected people to the land and to a sense of shared purpose. Every carrot pulled from the ground was one less carrot that needed to be shipped across the dangerous Atlantic. Every family that could feed itself from its own garden freed up food for soldiers and essential workers. The results were stunning. By 1943, it's estimated that home gardens, known as victory gardens, were producing over 1 million tons of vegetables in Britain alone. Allotments, which are small plots of land rented to individuals for gardening, numbered around 1.4 million. This civilian effort dramatically increased the domestic food supply. It reduced the reliance on imports and eased the strain on shipping. The same movement took hold in the United States, Canada, and Australia. In the US, by 1944, an estimated 20 million victory gardens produced roughly 8 million tons of food, which was about 40% of all the fresh fruits and vegetables consumed in the country that year. This story is well documented in books like The People's War by Angus Calder, which details the British home front. But the ingenuity went beyond just planting. People had to learn how to cook with what they had. The Ministry of Food published recipes for things like mock goose, made with potatoes and lentils, and Woolton pie, a pastry filled with whatever vegetables were available. People learned to be creative with rations, to waste nothing. This civilian-led food revolution didn't just prevent starvation. It built community. Neighbors shared tools, seeds, and advice. It fostered a sense of resilience that was vital for enduring the long, hard years of war. Yet, mysteries remain. How accurately were the crop yields from millions of tiny, undocumented gardens ever measured, and could the official numbers be wildly underestimated? What were the long-term ecological effects of digging up so much established green space, and did it permanently alter local ecosystems? And perhaps most importantly, did this forced return to local, seasonal eating create a generation with healthier diets than we have today, a benefit lost to history? Number 15. What if the best way to hide was in plain sight? In the autumn of 1943, a terrible message reached the people of Denmark. The German forces that had occupied their country since 1940 were preparing to round up and deport the entire Jewish population, about 7,800 people. In other parts of Europe, this process had been carried out with brutal efficiency, often with the compliance or indifference of the local population. But in Denmark, something different happened. It was an act of national civilian-led defiance that remains one of the most remarkable stories of the war. The news was leaked by a German diplomat, George Ferdinand Duckwitz, to Danish politicians. The politicians, in turn, warned the leaders of the Jewish community. The word spread like wildfire. The roundup was scheduled to begin on the night of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. When the occupying soldiers arrived at the homes, they found them empty. The vast majority of the Jewish population had vanished. They hadn't been taken by a secret army. They had been hidden by their neighbors. This was not a pre-planned operation organized by a professional resistance movement. It was a spontaneous uprising of conscience. Doctors took patients from hospitals and hid them in their own homes. The University of Copenhagen shut down, and students helped guide people to hiding places. Taxi drivers drove families to safety, often for free. Churches became sanctuaries. Complete strangers opened their doors to families they had never met, knowing that if they were caught, they could face prison or death. The ingenuity here was social and logistical. How do you hide thousands of people in a small, heavily policed country? The answer was a network of trust. People used their everyday jobs and knowledge. Fishermen prepared their boats for a fishing trip. Doctors signed fake medical certificates. Ordinary citizens became spies, watching troop movements and sharing information. The ultimate goal was to smuggle the refugees across the Øresund, the narrow strait of water separating Denmark from neutral Sweden. For several weeks, a makeshift underground railroad operated across the country. People were hidden in cellars, attics, and summer cottages along the coast. Then, under the cover of darkness, they were taken to the beaches. Fishermen, who knew the waters and the patrol schedules of the German Navy, loaded their small fishing boats with families and made the dangerous crossing to Sweden. It was incredibly risky. The boats were small, the sea was cold, and they could be spotted at any moment. Some charged money, but many did it for free, seeing it as their human duty. In the end, this collective act of civilian courage saved more than 7,200 of Denmark's Jews, over 95% of the population. It was a stunning success, documented in works like Lenny Yahil's The Rescue of Danish Jewry. It stands in stark contrast to what happened in so many other occupied countries. What made Denmark different was the widespread refusal of ordinary people to be complicit. The king, Christian X, had set a tone of solidarity early in the occupation, and this sentiment was shared by a huge portion of the population. They saw their Jewish neighbors not as other, but as fellow Danes. But deep questions persist about this incredible event. Was the German response intentionally lax, as some historians like Hannah Arendt have suggested, with some local commanders turning a blind eye for their own reasons? How did a nationwide conspiracy involving thousands of people hold together with so few leaks or betrayals? And what does it say about human nature that this level of mass, spontaneous compassion has been so rarely replicated in other genocides throughout history? Number 14. How do you turn a tin can into a fighter plane? By the time the United States entered the war in late 1941, the industrial needs were staggering. The country needed to build thousands of planes, ships, tanks, and guns, and it needed to do it fast. This required vast amounts of raw materials: steel, copper, aluminum, tin, and rubber. But many of these materials were now in short supply. The war in the Pacific had cut off sources of tin and rubber, and the demand from factories was insatiable. The government faced a huge challenge. How do you get millions of tons of scrap metal and other materials from people's homes and farms to the foundries and factories? The answer was one of the most visible and enthusiastic civilian efforts of the war: the scrap drives. It was a masterclass in public mobilization. The government, through the War Production Board, launched a massive propaganda campaign. Posters, radio ads, and movie newsreels all carried the same message: your junk can help win the war. The ingenuity was in making recycling a direct act of patriotism. The campaigns created a clear, simple mental link between a household item and a piece of military hardware. An old shovel can make 4 hand grenades. A 35-pound farm bell has enough steel for a 50 caliber machine gun. The most famous was the connection between aluminum and aircraft. Housewives were told that their old pots, pans, and aluminum foil could be melted down and turned into a fighter plane. The pots and pans for planes drives were a huge success. In one 1941 drive, it's estimated that Americans collected enough aluminum to build thousands of aircraft. Everyone got involved. It was a community effort. Schools organized competitions to see which class could collect the most scrap. The Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts went door to door with wagons, collecting old metal, paper, and rubber. Those farmers dragged old, broken machinery out of their barns. People stripped their cars of unnecessary chrome bumpers and trim called victory trim. In towns across the country, huge piles of scrap metal grew in the town square, a visible symbol of the community's contribution. The drives collected everything, not just metal, but also rubber from old tires and garden hoses. Fats and grease from cooking were collected in cans and turned into glycerin for making explosives. Even silk and nylon stockings were collected to be repurposed for things like parachutes and powder bags for naval guns. The scale was documented by the government itself. In 1942 alone, American civilians collected an estimated 5 million tons of scrap steel and over 500,000 tons of scrap tin. This wasn't just about the material, though that was crucial. As detailed in books like Freedom's Forge by Arthur Herman, the scrap drives had a profound psychological effect. Like Victory Gardens, they gave every single person a way to participate in the war. It was a way of connecting the home front directly to the battlefront. When you heard a plane fly overhead, you could think that maybe, just maybe, your old frying pan was a part of it. It made the immense, abstract concept of a world war feel personal and manageable. It was a war fought not just by soldiers, but by every family on every street, armed with a rusty shovel and a can of bacon grease. But there are lingering questions about the true efficiency of the drives. How much of the collected material, particularly the aluminum from household pots, was actually pure enough to be used in high-grade military applications like aircraft? Did the government overstate the direct link between a pot and a plane for propaganda purposes, with much of the scrap being used for less glamorous but equally important purposes? And how much of the success was driven by genuine patriotism versus the intense social pressure to be seen contributing to the public scrap pile? Number 13, can you invent a lifeline out of thin air? In the early days of the war, one of the biggest killers on the battlefield wasn't the enemy's bullet. It was shock. A soldier would be wounded, and even if the injury wasn't immediately fatal, they would often die from blood loss before they could get proper medical attention. Transfusing whole blood was difficult. It required refrigeration, it had a short shelf life, and it needed to be matched to the recipient's blood type, a complicated process in the chaos of a field hospital. The military needed a better way to save lives. The solution came from the world of civilian medicine and science, spearheaded by a brilliant African-American surgeon named Dr. Charles R. Drew. In the late 1930s, Drew had been doing pioneering research at Columbia University on blood preservation. He and his colleagues perfected a method for separating plasma, the liquid part of blood, from the red and white blood cells. This was a game changer. The ingenuity of using plasma was threefold. First, it could be dried into a powder, shipped long distances without refrigeration, and then reconstituted with sterilized water right on the battlefield. This made it incredibly portable. Second, type AB plasma is a universal donor, meaning it can be given to a person with any blood type, eliminating the need for time-consuming matching in an emergency. Third, its primary function was to combat shock by restoring blood volume, giving a wounded soldier the stability they needed to survive until they could get to a proper hospital for surgery. When the war broke out in Europe, Britain was desperate for medical supplies, especially after the Blitz began. They turned to the United States for help. In 1940, Dr. Drew was chosen to head up a pilot program called Blood for Britain. He organized a massive blood collection and processing effort, proving that large quantities of plasma could be prepared and shipped safely overseas. His systems were so efficient and his standards for safety so high that they became the model for everything that followed. When the U.S. entered the war, Drew was appointed the director of the first American Red Cross blood bank. He, along with the Red Cross, launched a massive civilian effort to collect blood. Just like the scrap drives, this was framed as a patriotic duty. Mobile blood donation centers, called bloodmobiles, traveled to towns, factories, and offices. The slogan, "Give a pint of your blood to save a soldier's life," was everywhere. Millions of ordinary Americans lined up to donate. It was another way the home front could directly support the troops. By the end of the war, the American Red Cross had collected over 13 million units of blood from civilian volunteers, much of which was processed into the life-saving plasma. Dr. Drew's contribution, detailed in books like Charles Drew Pioneer and Blood Plasma by Anne Schraff, was monumental. His work saved an untold number of lives. However, his story is also marked by a tragic irony. The U.S. military at the time insisted on segregating the blood donated by black and white citizens, despite there being no scientific difference. Dr. Drew, the man who had perfected the whole system, vehemently protested this unscientific and discriminatory policy. He argued that blood had no race, only a type. Frustrated by the policy, he resigned from his position at the Red Cross in 1942. His genius had created a lifeline, but he couldn't convince the system to overcome its own prejudice. Still, the questions surrounding this innovation are profound. How many soldiers survived their injuries specifically because of plasma, a number that is almost impossible to calculate but is likely in the hundreds of thousands? What would battlefield medicine look like today if the techniques for mass plasma production hadn't been perfected under the intense pressure of the war? And how did Dr. Drew's quiet, principled stand against segregation within his own life-saving program influence the later civil rights movement in medicine and beyond? Number 12. How did women in fields keep a country from starving? As men across Britain left their jobs to join the military, a massive labor shortage developed. This was felt everywhere, but nowhere more critically than on the farms. Food production was essential for survival, as the Dig for Victory campaign showed. But who was going to plow the fields, milk the cows, and harvest the crops? The country needed a new army, an army of farmers, and it found one in a place many had never thought to look: the nation's women. This led to the revival and massive expansion of the Women's Land Army WLA. The WLA had existed in a smaller form during the First World War, but the scale of its operation in the Second World War was unprecedented. It was a civilian organization that recruited women from all walks of life to work on farms. They were known as land girls. They came from cities and towns, and many had never been on a farm before. They were secretaries, shop assistants, hairdressers, and factory workers who traded in their normal lives for hard physical labor. The ingenuity here was in social organization and training. The government had to convince not only the women to sign up, but also the conservative, male-dominated farming community to accept them. Many farmers were initially skeptical, believing that women weren't strong enough for the demanding work. The WLA had to prove them wrong. They set up training centers to teach the new recruits the basics of agriculture. The women learned to drive tractors, a new and intimidating technology for many. They learned about crop rotation, animal husbandry, and pest control. Life as a land girl was tough. The hours were long, the work was physically grueling, and the pay was low. They lived in rural hostels or were billeted with farming families. They wore a uniform of green jerseys, brown breeches, and felt hats. They faced all the challenges of farming, bad weather, difficult animals, and the constant pressure to increase yields. But they persevered. They became experts in their new roles. They operated heavy machinery, managed dairy herds, and brought in the harvests that fed the nation. The numbers tell the story. At its peak in 1944, there were over 80,000 women serving in the Women's Land Army in Britain. Similar organizations were formed in other countries, like the Women's Land Army of America. Their impact on food production was immense. They were a crucial part of the reason Britain managed to avoid starvation and dramatically increase its domestic food supply during the war. They proved the skeptics wrong and demonstrated that women could do the man's work of farming just as well as anyone. Their story is captured in memoirs and historical accounts like Jambusters by Julie Summers, which looks at the broader role of women in rural Britain during the war. But the WLA was more than just a labor force. It was a social revolution. For many young women, it was their first taste of independence. It took them out of their homes and traditional roles and gave them new skills and a sense of confidence. It challenged deep-seated prejudices about women's capabilities. Yet, despite their vital contribution, the land girls were not given the same recognition as women in the military services. After the war, they were not granted the same post-war benefits and were largely expected to return to domestic life. Their civilian service was, for a long time, overlooked by official history. This history leaves us with unsettling questions. Why was this crucial civilian workforce denied official recognition and veterans' benefits for so many decades after the war? How did the experience of living and working independently on farms change the personal ambitions and life trajectories of the hundreds of thousands of women who served? And what traditional farming knowledge passed down through generations of men was lost or transformed when a new, largely urban workforce had to learn the job from scratch? Number 11. Could an accountant's mind defeat an army? Deep in the English countryside, at a Victorian estate called Bletchley Park, one of the most secret and decisive battles of the war was fought. It wasn't a battle with guns or tanks, it was a battle of minds. And the soldiers were not professional military officers. They were a strange and brilliant collection of civilians, university mathematicians, linguists, chess grandmasters, and even crossword puzzle champions. Their job was to break the enemy's codes. The German military believed its communication codes were unbreakable. They used a sophisticated machine called the Enigma, which could scramble messages into a seemingly random string of letters. They used an even more complex system, the Lorenz cipher, for high-level communications. Cracking these codes by hand was practically impossible. The number of possible settings on the Enigma machine alone ran into the millions of millions. The ingenuity at Bletchley Park was a unique blend of human intellect and early computing technology. The British government scoured the country for people with a very specific kind of brain, people who could see patterns where others saw only chaos. They were recruited through unconventional means. One famous story tells of a recruitment competition based on a crossword puzzle in the Daily Telegraph. These civilian recruits were brought to Bletchley Park under a strict oath of secrecy. Many of them never told their families what they did during the war. Leading figures like the mathematician Alan Turing were at the heart of the operation. Turing and his colleagues were not just trying to crack the codes with pencil and paper. They were designing machines to do it. They developed the bomb, an electromechanical device that could rapidly test thousands of possible Enigma settings, listening for a contradiction that would reveal the correct one. For the more complex Lorenz cipher, they created Colossus, which is often considered the world's first programmable electronic digital computer. These machines were the ancestors of the computers we use today. The work was a relentless 24-hour-a-day grind. The codebreakers worked in drafty, wooden huts, huddled over complex machinery and endless streams of intercepted messages. Every day, the German military changed the settings on their Enigma machines, so every day the codebreakers had to start from scratch. A single breakthrough could reveal the location of U-boat wolf packs in the Atlantic, give advance warning of an air raid, or uncover the enemy's battle plans. The intelligence they produced, codenamed Ultra, was so valuable that it was shared only with the highest levels of Allied command. The impact of this civilian-led effort was immense. Historians like Sir Harry Hinsley, who worked at Bletchley himself, have estimated that the intelligence from Bletchley Park shortened the war by at least 2 years, saving millions of lives. It gave the Allies a secret window into the enemy's mind. It was a war-winning contribution made by people who never fired a shot. Their story was kept secret for decades after the war, and the full extent of their achievements is detailed in books like The Codebreakers by David Kahn and The Secret Life of Bletchley Park by Sinclair McKay. But the secrecy that shrouded Bletchley Park for so long means many questions are still unanswered. How many other brilliant, unconventional minds were part of the effort, their contributions lost to history because their work was never declassified? What other technological innovations, beyond the bombing Colossus, were developed in secret and then shelved or forgotten after the war? And perhaps most profoundly, how did the immense psychological pressure of knowing the enemy's plans but being unable to act on all of them for fear of revealing the source affect the codebreakers who lived with that burden every day? Number 10, how do you build a weapon from a theory? In August 1939, just before the war began in Europe, a letter was delivered to U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt. It was signed by Albert Einstein, but it had been drafted largely by a group of fellow physicists who had fled persecution in Europe. The letter contained a stark warning. Recent breakthroughs in nuclear physics suggested it might be possible to create a new kind of bomb, a single weapon of unprecedented and terrifying power. And the letter warned the German regime might be trying to build one. This letter set in motion one of the largest, most secret, and most consequential scientific and industrial projects in history. It was codenamed the Manhattan Project. Its goal was to build an atomic bomb. And while it was directed by the military, specifically General Leslie Groves, the intellectual and scientific driving force behind it was almost entirely civilian. The project was an act of pure theoretical ingenuity brought to life on an industrial scale. The government brought together the most brilliant scientific minds in the world. Many were academics from universities like Columbia, Chicago, and Berkeley. People like J. Robert Oppenheimer, a charismatic theoretical physicist from California, was chosen to lead the secret weapons laboratory at Los Alamos, New Mexico. Enrico Fermi, an Italian physicist, led the team in Chicago that achieved the first self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction, a critical proof of concept. The project was a magnet for Nobel laureates and future ones. The challenges were immense. They were working from pure theory. No one had ever built a nuclear reactor, let alone a bomb. They had to figure out how to enrich uranium and produce plutonium, 2 different paths to a weapon, and they pursued both simultaneously because they didn't know which would work. This required building entire cities from scratch. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington became massive, secret industrial complexes dedicated to producing fissile materials. Los Alamos, a remote mesa in the desert, became a self-contained town where scientists and their families lived in secrecy, wrestling with the complex physics of weapon design. The ingenuity was breathtaking. Scientists and engineers had to invent new technologies and new industrial processes at every step. They were pushing the boundaries of what was known in physics, chemistry, and engineering. The project employed over 130,000 people and cost nearly $2 billion, the equivalent of over $30 billion today. Most of the workers had no idea what they were building. They were just told that their work was vital to winning the war. Secrecy was absolute. In July 1945, at a test site in New Mexico codenamed Trinity, their work culminated in the successful detonation of the first atomic bomb. The power of the blast shocked even the scientists who had created it. Oppenheimer famously recalled a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The project, as chronicled in Richard Rhodes's definitive book, The Making of the Atomic Bomb, was a triumph of scientific and organizational ingenuity. It brought together theoretical science, industrial might, and civilian brainpower to create the most powerful weapon ever known. A few weeks later, two of these weapons were used on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, leading to the end of the war. The Manhattan Project stands as a stark and complex example of civilian ingenuity, but the questions it leaves behind are among the most difficult in human history. What was the full extent of the health impact on the civilian workers at places like Hanford, who were exposed to radiation without fully understanding the risks? How did the scientists, who were driven by intellectual curiosity and a desire to defeat a dangerous enemy, grapple with the moral and ethical consequences of their creation for the rest of their lives? And did the invention of this weapon truly prevent future world wars, as some argue, or did it just trap humanity in a new, more terrifying kind of standoff that could still end in global catastrophe? Number 9, can mending a sock be an act of war? On the home front, the war wasn't just about big, dramatic projects. It was also fought in millions of small, quiet ways every single day. One of the most pervasive challenges for civilians, particularly in Britain, was rationing. Everything was in short supply: food, gasoline, and especially clothing. Clothes rationing was introduced in Britain in June 1941. Each person was given a book of coupons that had to be used to buy new clothes, and the allowance was small. This created a huge problem. How do you keep yourself and your family clothed when you can't just go out and buy something new? The answer was a nationwide movement of civilian ingenuity known as Make, Do, and Mend. The government, through the Board of Trade, promoted the idea with pamphlets, posters, and films. The message was simple: don't throw anything away. Repair it, remake it, reuse it. Mending a sock or patching a pair of trousers became a patriotic duty. Throwing away a worn-out garment was seen as wasteful and helping the enemy. This campaign unleashed a wave of creativity. People learned old skills and invented new ones. Magazines and newspapers were filled with tips on how to get the most out of every scrap of fabric. A man's old suit could be unpicked and re-sewn into a smart skirt for a woman or a coat for a child. Old blankets were turned into winter coats. Even blackout curtains, once they were no longer needed, were repurposed into dresses and skirts. The humble parachute, made of silk or the new wonder fabric nylon, was a prized material. When a down parachute was found, it was quickly cut up and turned into blouses, lingerie, and even wedding dresses. The ingenuity was often in the details. People learned how to unknit old woolen sweaters to reuse the yarn. They drew seams on the backs of their legs with gravy browning or eyeliner to create the illusion of wearing stockings, which were nearly impossible to find. Special classes were set up to teach sewing and darning skills. It was a complete shift in mindset from a culture of consumption to a culture of conservation. This movement was largely led by women, who were traditionally in charge of the household and clothing. They became experts in thrift and resourcefulness. The make, do, and mend philosophy, detailed in publications from the era and studied in books like Fashion on the Ration by Julie Summers, was about more than just saving money or coupons. It was a way of maintaining morale and a sense of normalcy in a world of deprivation. Being able to dress your children in decent mended clothes was a small victory against the chaos of war. It was a way of exercising control and creativity when so much was out of your hands. This wasn't just a British phenomenon. In the United States, the War Production Board issued Regulation L-85, which restricted the use of fabric in clothing. Skirts became shorter and narrower. Cuffs on trousers disappeared. The zoot suit, with its extravagant use of fabric, was seen as unpatriotic and even led to riots in 1943. Across the Allied nations, civilians learned to live with less and make the most of what they had. It was a quiet, domestic front line where the weapons were a needle and thread, and victory was a perfectly patched elbow. Yet, this quiet revolution has left us with some intriguing questions. How much fabric was actually saved by these efforts? And did it make a measurable difference to the supply of materials like wool and cotton for military uniforms? Did the enforced creativity of the era lead to lasting innovations in fashion and design that we no longer recognize as having wartime origins? And has our modern fast fashion culture, with its emphasis on disposability, caused us to lose a whole set of valuable skills and a mindset of resourcefulness that were once essential for survival? Number 8, how could civilian pilots defend an entire coastline? In the early months of 1942, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the east coast of the United States was in a state of panic. German U-boats were operating with terrifying freedom, just offshore, sinking merchant ships and oil tankers, sometimes within sight of land. The U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces were stretched thin, fighting a war on two fronts, and they didn't have enough ships or planes to effectively patrol the thousands of miles of coastline. The U-boats were winning what was called the Battle of the Atlantic. The military was overwhelmed. But a group of civilian pilots, flight instructors, and aviation enthusiasts had an idea. They believed they could help. This led to the creation of one of the most unusual and effective civilian-military collaborations of the war, the Civil Air Patrol CAP. Founded just a week before Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the CAP was a volunteer civilian organization designed to use private planes and pilots for national service. The ingenuity of the CAP was to harness an existing resource, America's thriving community of private pilots and their small aircraft. These were people who flew for fun or ran small charter services. Their planes were Stinsons, Fairchilds, and Pipers, not military bombers. But they could fly low and slow, they knew the local coastlines intimately, and there were a lot of them. The military was initially skeptical. The idea of sending civilian volunteers in unarmed light aircraft to hunt for sophisticated enemy submarines seemed absurd, even suicidal. But the need was desperate. In 1942, the CAP was authorized to fly anti-submarine patrols. From bases strung along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, these civilian pilots flew their own planes out over the ocean. At first, their job was just to spot U-boats and radio their location to the military, but the U-boats would often just dive and escape. So the CAP planes were armed. They were fitted with small bombs and depth charges. A civilian accountant or dentist would fly his single-engine plane out over the ocean, with another civilian volunteer as an observer and bombardier, actively hunting for enemy warships. It was incredibly dangerous work. They flew in all kinds of weather, often far out of sight of land, with primitive navigation equipment. Their planes were slow and vulnerable. If their engine failed, they would be lost in the Atlantic, but it worked. The constant presence of the CAP patrols forced the U-boats to stay submerged during the day, which made them less effective. And the CAP did attack. In total, CAP aircraft flew over 24 million miles on anti-submarine patrol, spotted 173 U-boats, and attacked 57 of them. They are credited with sinking or helping to sink at least 2. The story of the CAP, documented in official histories and books like The Civil Air Patrol by C.B. Glines, is a remarkable tale of civilian bravery. By the time the military was able to take over the patrols in late 1943, the U-boat threat on the East Coast had been dramatically reduced. The CAP's contribution was vital in bridging a critical gap in the nation's defenses. After their anti-submarine role ended, they continued to serve, flying search and rescue missions, towing targets for anti-aircraft practice, and flying courier missions for the military. The organization still exists today as a civilian auxiliary of the U.S. Air Force, but the legacy of this civilian Air Force raises some fascinating questions. How many CAP members were lost at sea during these perilous patrols, their sacrifices never receiving the same public recognition as military casualties? What specific unrecorded acts of ingenuity did these pilots develop to spot submarines, like reading subtle changes in the water or marine life behavior? And in an age of satellite and drone surveillance, is there still a role for the kind of local knowledge and volunteer spirit that the CAP represented? Number 7, what if you ran out of bouncy stuff? Think about how many things in the modern world depend on rubber. Tires for every car, truck, and airplane. Hoses, gaskets, seals in engines, the soles of boots. It's a critical strategic material. In the early 1940s, the United States got over 90% of its natural rubber from plantations in Southeast Asia. Then, in 1942, Japanese forces conquered these territories. The American supply of natural rubber was almost completely cut off. This was a catastrophe. The U.S. was trying to build a massive mechanized army, an air force of thousands of planes, and a navy that stretched across the globe. Every single one of those machines needed rubber. Without it, the war effort would literally grind to a halt. The country had a small stockpile, but it would run out fast, like the nation faced a rubber crisis. The solution was a massive coordinated effort of civilian, corporate, and academic ingenuity to create an entirely new industry from scratch, synthetic rubber. The science wasn't completely new. Chemists in Germany and the US had been experimenting with synthetic rubber for years, but no one had ever tried to produce it on an industrial scale. The challenge was enormous. The US needed to invent the processes, design the factories, and build them, all in a desperately short amount of time. President Roosevelt appointed a rubber survey committee, and the government created the Rubber Reserve Company to oversee the project. They pooled the patents and knowledge of the big rubber and chemical companies like Firestone, Goodrich, Goodyear, and Standard Oil. This was a suspension of normal corporate competition for the national good. They enlisted top chemists and engineers from universities across the country. It was a project on the scale of the Manhattan Project, but it was focused on a much more mundane, yet equally vital, material. The ingenuity was in the speed and scale of the industrial ramp-up. The government funded the construction of over 50 new factories. The standard process they settled on produced a general-purpose synthetic rubber called GRS Government Rubber Styrene. The raw materials for it came from petroleum and alcohol, so the project also required a massive increase in the production of these chemicals. The distilleries that once made whiskey were converted to produce industrial alcohol. At the same time, the government launched a huge conservation and recycling campaign on the home front. Civilians were urged to drive less to save their tires. A national speed limit of 35 miles per hour, the Victory Speed, was imposed to reduce tire wear. And just like the scrap metal drives, there were massive rubber scrap drives. People turned in old tires, hot water bottles, rubber boots, and garden hoses. This collected scrap, as detailed in books on the American home front like John Morton Bloom's V for Victory, was a crucial stopgap measure while the new synthetic plants were being built. The results of the synthetic rubber program were astonishing. In 1941, the U.S. produced less than 10,000 tons of synthetic rubber. By 1944, production had soared to over 750,000 tons, more than the country had ever imported in a year. This civilian-led industrial miracle kept the Allied armies rolling. The tires on the jeeps that landed in Normandy, the seals on the bombers that flew over Europe, were made of a material that had barely existed a few years earlier. It was a victory of chemistry and engineering, born of sheer necessity. But this incredible achievement has some overlooked aspects. What were the long-term environmental consequences of building this massive petrochemical industry so quickly, with wartime urgency overriding environmental concerns? How did the pooling of corporate patents under government direction permanently reshape the chemical and rubber industries after the war? And did the success of synthetic rubber reduce the perceived strategic importance of natural rubber producing regions, subtly altering post-war foreign policy and trade for decades to come? Number 6. How could whispers topple an empire? In occupied France, the enemy was everywhere. Soldiers patrolled the streets. Secret police listened for any hint of dissent. Open resistance was suicidal. Yet, a vast and powerful opposition movement grew in the shadows. This was the French resistance. It wasn't a single organized army. It was a sprawling, decentralized network of ordinary men and women, right? Like they were students, priests, housewives, shopkeepers, and farmers. And their most powerful weapons were not guns, but information and communication. The ingenuity of the resistance was in its ability to create secure and resilient communication networks using everyday tools and incredible bravery. They had to pass messages, coordinate acts of sabotage, and get vital intelligence to the Allies in London, all while being hunted by a ruthless enemy. They developed a stunning array of clever techniques. One of the most important tools was the radio. Small groups of radio operators, many of them women, would set up their transmitters in attics or basements. They would send coded messages to London detailing troop movements, railway traffic, and coastal defenses. This was one of the most dangerous jobs. The German direction-finding teams were constantly sweeping the cities, and the average life expectancy of a radio operator was only about 6 months. They had to transmit their message quickly and then move immediately to a new location. For messages within France, they relied on human couriers, Young women were often chosen for this role as they were thought to attract less suspicion. They would carry messages hidden in hollowed-out loaves of bread, in their bicycle handlebars, or written in invisible ink on what looked like an ordinary letter. They crisscrossed the country by train and bicycle, forming the connective tissue of the resistance. The ingenuity extended to mass communication. The resistance published hundreds of underground newspapers. These were often just a few mimeograph sheets, produced in secret on hidden presses. They provided real news about the war, countering the propaganda of the occupiers. They published essays and poems to keep morale up. Simply possessing one of these newspapers was a crime punishable by death, yet they were printed and distributed by the thousands, passed from hand to hand. The story of these efforts is documented in historical accounts like The Silent War by Olivier Wiviorca. They also used subtle, clever codes in public. A personal ad in a newspaper might contain a hidden message. A certain song played on the BBC's French language service could be a signal for a sabotage operation to begin. The famous first line of a poem by Paul Verlaine, "The long sobs of the violins of autumn," broadcast in June 1944, was the signal to the entire resistance that the D-Day invasion was imminent and that they should begin their pre-planned attacks on railways and communication lines. This was a war of wits, fought by civilians. They had to be constantly creative, constantly adapting. They were not professional spies. They were ordinary people who learned the craft of espionage and covert communication out of necessity. Their collective effort provided the Allies with a priceless stream of intelligence and caused chaos behind enemy lines. General Eisenhower himself estimated that the contribution of the French resistance was equivalent to 15 divisions of regular soldiers. But the history of the resistance is full of shadows and secrets. How many small local resistance networks existed that were never known to the major organizations and whose stories of ingenuity and sacrifice have been completely lost? What were the psychological tools and techniques that leaders used to maintain trust and morale in an environment where a single betrayal could destroy an entire network? And how did the skills of deception and secrecy learned out of necessity during the war affect the personal relationships and civilian lives of the survivors after the liberation? Number 5, could a poster that no one saw still win the war? In 1939, as war loomed, the British government's Ministry of Information was tasked with a difficult job: prepare the public for the horrors to come, especially the threat of massive air raids. They needed to create propaganda that would steel the nation's resolve. They designed a series of 3 posters with a simple, uniform design, a crown at the top, followed by a message in a clear, strong typeface. The first 2 posters were widely distributed. One read, "Your courage, your cheerfulness, your resolution will bring us victory." The other said, "Freedom is in peril. Defend it with all your might." But there was a third poster, a backup plan. It was printed in vast numbers, nearly 2.5 million copies. It was to be held in reserve and only used in the event of a national catastrophe, like a successful enemy invasion. Its message was the simplest of all: keep calm and carry on. As it happened, an invasion never came. The poster was never officially issued. The vast majority of the printed copies were pulped and recycled for the war effort. For over 50 years, this piece of civilian-facing propaganda was almost completely forgotten. It was a ghost of a campaign, an artifact of a disaster that never happened. The story of its rediscovery is a piece of modern ingenuity itself. In 2000, the owners of a second-hand bookshop in Northumberland, Barter Books, found a copy folded up in a box of old books they had bought at auction. They framed it and hung it in their shop. It attracted so much attention from customers that they decided to print and sell copies. From there, its popularity exploded. It became a global phenomenon, appearing on mugs, t-shirts, and countless internet memes. It has come to symbolize a certain kind of British stoicism and resilience. While the poster itself had no direct impact during the war, it represents the immense civilian effort that went into psychological warfare and morale. Both sides understood that this was a war for hearts and minds. The ingenuity was in the messaging. In Britain, government artists and writers worked with advertising executives to craft campaigns. They created characters like the Squander Bug, a mischievous creature that encouraged wasteful spending. They produced films, radio shows, and pamphlets, all designed to shape public opinion, encourage conservation, and maintain morale. In the United States, this effort was even larger. The Office of War Information, OWI, coordinated propaganda across all media. They enlisted famous Hollywood directors like Frank Capra to produce the Why We Fight series of documentary films, shown to both soldiers and civilians. They worked with advertisers to get war messages into popular radio shows. Artists created iconic posters, urging people to buy war bonds or warning that loose lips sink ships. This was a sophisticated civilian-led effort to mobilize the national will. As detailed in books like Selling the War by Mark H. Leff, it used the tools of modern advertising and mass media to sell the war to the public. So while Keep Calm and Carry On is an accidental icon, it's a powerful symbol of a very real and ingenious effort. It reminds us that wars are fought not just with physical weapons, but with ideas, emotions, and a shared story. The goal was to build a sense of unity and purpose, to convince millions of individual civilians that their small personal sacrifices were part of a vast, noble, and ultimately victorious cause. But this raises some complex questions. How much of the wartime unity and high morale was genuine, and how much was a carefully constructed illusion created by government propagandists? Did the techniques of mass persuasion, perfected during the war to sell patriotism, get repurposed by the advertising industry after the war to sell consumer goods, shaping our modern culture in ways we don't fully understand? And what does it say about our own time that a forgotten 70-year-old poster, designed for a crisis that never happened, resonates so deeply with people today? Number 4, how can you pay for the most expensive thing in history? Fighting a global war is unimaginably expensive. In the 1940s, the US government was spending hundreds of millions of dollars every single day. The money was needed for everything: building planes and ships, paying soldiers, funding scientific research, and sending aid to allies. The government could raise some of this money through taxes, but it wasn't nearly enough. It needed to borrow, and it needed to borrow on a massive scale. The ingenious solution was to borrow not just from banks and large institutions, but from ordinary citizens. This was the war bond program. It was a financial instrument, but it was sold to the public as an act of patriotic duty. The government, specifically the Treasury Department, launched a series of massive war loan drives to convince every American to lend their savings to the government. The ingenuity was all in the marketing. This was one of the biggest and most successful advertising campaigns in history. They didn't sell bonds as a dry financial investment. They sold them as a direct way to support the troops. The ads were emotional and personal. Buy a bond to bring a soldier home. A poster would show a picture of a bomb and say, "This bomb costs $50. You can pay for it." It created a tangible link between a person's savings and the war effort. They used every tool of mass communication. Hollywood stars went on nationwide tours holding massive rallies to sell bonds. Bing Crosby recorded songs about buying bonds. Popular comic strip characters urged their readers to buy bonds. There were bond premieres for movies, where the price of admission was a bond purchase. Companies set up payroll deduction plans, making it easy for workers to put a small amount of each paycheck toward bonds. School children bought war stamps for as little as 10 cents, pasting them into a book until they had enough to buy a full $18.75 bond. The scale of this civilian effort was staggering. Over the course of the war, more than 85 million Americans, over half the population, purchased war bonds. In total, they raised over $185 billion. This covered more than half of the total cost of the war. It was a colossal financial achievement driven by millions of small individual acts. The story of this mobilization is covered in studies of the U.S. home front, showing how the government effectively managed a wartime economy. But the war bond program was about more than just money. It had 2 other crucial effects. First, it gave people a safe place to put their savings. With factories running 24/7, people were earning good wages, but with rationing, there wasn't much to buy. The bond program soaked up this extra cash, which helped to control inflation. Second, and perhaps most importantly, it was a powerful tool for morale. Like victory gardens and scrap drives, buying a bond was a way for every citizen to feel like they had a personal stake in the outcome of the war. It was a democratic way of funding a war for democracy. When a family hung "We bought a war bond" sticker in their window, it was a public declaration of their commitment. This massive financial mobilization, however, leaves some important questions unanswered. How much of the bond purchasing was driven by genuine patriotism versus intense peer pressure from employers, community leaders, and celebrity endorsements? What was the long-term economic impact on the millions of working-class families who invested their modest savings in these bonds, and did it fuel the post-war economic boom? And could a government today, in a more cynical and politically divided age, ever successfully launch a voluntary program on this scale? Number 3, could a bit of mold change the course of a war? For most of human history, a simple infection could be a death sentence. A soldier who survived a terrible wound on the battlefield could die days later from the bacteria that got into the cut. In the First World War, deaths from infection in hospitals were tragically common. Doctors had antiseptics to clean wounds, but they had no way to fight an infection that had already taken hold inside the body. They were powerless against bacteria. The discovery that would change all of that happened by accident in a London laboratory in 1928. A Scottish scientist named Alexander Fleming noticed that a patch of mold, Penicillium notatum, had contaminated one of his petri dishes and was killing the bacteria around it. He realized that the mold was producing a substance that could be a powerful weapon against bacteria. He called it penicillin, but Fleming was a researcher, not a drug developer. He published his findings, but the challenge of isolating and purifying enough penicillin to use as a medicine seemed insurmountable. For over a decade, his discovery remained a scientific curiosity. The intense pressure of the Second World War changed everything. With the prospect of massive casualties, the need for a drug that could cure bacterial infections became a top priority for the Allied nations. A team of scientists at Oxford University, led by Howard Florey and Ernst Boris Chain, picked up Fleming's research. They were civilians driven by scientific inquiry. In 1940, they managed to produce a small amount of purified penicillin and proved that it was incredibly effective at curing deadly infections in mice. The next year, they successfully treated the first human patient. The ingenuity here was in turning a laboratory discovery into a mass-produced drug. Britain, under constant air attack, didn't have the industrial capacity to produce the vast quantities of penicillin needed for the war. So in 1941, Florey and a colleague traveled to the United States to seek help. They went to a government research lab in Peoria, Illinois. This is where the civilian industrial ingenuity really took off. Scientists at the Peoria lab made 2 crucial breakthroughs. A lab assistant, Mary Hunt, nicknamed Moldy Mary, found a cantaloupe in a local market that was covered in a particularly potent strain of penicillium. This strain produced much more penicillin than Fleming's original. Then, the scientists discovered that they could dramatically increase the yield by growing the mold in large, deep fermentation tanks, like those used in breweries, instead of in shallow flasks. The U.S. government, through the War Production Board, then coordinated a massive effort involving over 20 pharmaceutical and chemical companies. They shared research, developed new production techniques, and built huge new factories. It was another example of suspending competition for a common cause. By 1943, they were producing enough penicillin to meet the needs of the military. By the D-Day invasion in June 1944, they had stockpiled enough to treat every single wounded Allied soldier. The impact was revolutionary. The story is told in books like The Mold in Dr. Florey's Coat by Eric Lax. The penicillin dramatically reduced the death rate from infected wounds and from diseases like pneumonia. It saved hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of lives during the war. It was a miracle drug, a product of civilian scientific curiosity, academic perseverance, and industrial might, all accelerated by the terrible urgency of war. After the war, it became available to the public and launched the age of antibiotics, transforming modern medicine forever. But this medical miracle has a more complex legacy. We now know that the overuse of antibiotics has led to the rise of antibiotic-resistant superbugs, a major public health crisis. Did the wartime mass production mindset that made penicillin a success also set the stage for its eventual overuse? How many of the promising avenues of medical research were abandoned or ignored during the war because all resources were focused on projects with immediate military application like penicillin? And what role did the women like Moldy Mary, who did so much of the painstaking lab work, play in the scientific breakthroughs, and have their contributions been fully recognized by history? Number 2, how did a screeching sound save a nation? In the summer of 1940, during the Battle of Britain, a small number of Royal Air Force pilots and their Spitfires and Hurricanes were all that stood in the way of a full-scale invasion. They were outnumbered by the German Luftwaffe. On paper, they should have lost, but they had a secret weapon. It wasn't a faster plane or a bigger gun. It was an invisible shield, a system of early warning that allowed them to know exactly when and where the enemy was coming from. This system was radar. And it was the product of years of work by a team of civilian scientists led by a Scottish physicist named Robert Watson Watt. In the 1930s, the British government was terrified of the threat of bomber aircraft. They asked Watson Watt if it was possible to build a death ray that could destroy planes in the sky. Watson Watt and his colleague Arnold Wilkins did the calculations and concluded that a death ray was not feasible. But they suggested it might be possible to use radio waves to detect a plane long before it could be seen or heard. This was the birth of radar, a term that was actually coined by the US Navy later. The ingenuity was in taking a scientific principle, rather that radio waves bounce off objects, and turning it into a practical, large-scale military defense system. Watson Watt and his team of civilian scientists working in great secrecy at a remote site on the coast developed the technology. They built a chain of huge transmitter towers along the south and east coasts of England. This was the chain home system. The system worked by sending out pulses of radio waves. When these waves hit an aircraft, they would bounce back and be picked up by a receiver. On a cathode ray screen, this would appear as a blip of light. By measuring the time it took for the pulse to return, an operator could calculate the distance to the plane. By using directional antennas, they could determine its direction and altitude. This was a revolutionary development, but the technology was only half the story. The other half was the human system they built around it. The information from the radar stations was fed into a central filter room where it was collated and plotted on a giant map table. Most of the people doing this crucial high-pressure work were members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force WAIF. These civilian women were the heart of the system. They had to interpret the blips on the screen, track multiple enemy formations at once, and communicate that information clearly and calmly to the RAF command centers. Thanks to this system, the RAF didn't have to fly constant, exhausting patrols. They could keep their planes and pilots on the ground, ready to scramble the moment the radar picked up an incoming raid. They could direct their limited number of fighters precisely to where they were needed most. It turned the sky from a vast, frightening unknown into a manageable three-dimensional chessboard. The German pilots were bewildered. It seemed like the British always knew where they were. The success of the chain home system, as described in books like A Radar History of World War II by Louis Brown, was a decisive factor in winning the Battle of Britain. It was a victory won not just by the pilots, but by the civilian scientists who invented the technology and the thousands of ordinary people, many of them young women who operated the system around the clock. It was a triumph of applied science and human organization, but the secret history of radar still holds mysteries. What alternative radar technologies were being developed by other civilian teams that were ultimately rejected in favor of Watson Watt's system, and were they potentially better? How did the intense secrecy surrounding radar development affect the post-war careers of the thousands of men and women who worked on it, but could never speak about their experiences? And did the success of this top-down centralized command and control system, born out of radar, influence the corporate and governmental management structures of the post-war world in ways we are still living with today? Number one, what happens when the front line is your street? The Second World War was called a total war for a reason. For the first time in modern history, the distinction between the battlefield and the home front often blurred to the point of disappearing. In cities across Britain, Russia, Germany, and Japan, the war came directly to the civilian population in the form of strategic bombing campaigns. The front line was no longer a distant trench. It was your street, your house, your neighborhood. Faced with this new and terrifying reality, civilians had to develop their own systems of defense and survival. This gave rise to one of the largest and most underappreciated civilian ingenuity movements of the War Air Raid Precautions, or ARP. In Britain, the ARP was a massive civil defense organization staffed almost entirely by unpaid volunteers. They were ordinary people who, after a full day of work, would put on a helmet and an armband and take on the responsibility of protecting their own communities. The ingenuity of the ARP was in its hyperlocal organization and its practical problem-solving approach. These were not soldiers. They were shopkeepers, librarians, and retired civil servants. They became air raid wardens, volunteer firefighters, ambulance drivers, and rescue workers. Their job was to manage the chaos during and after a bombing raid. They enforced the blackout, walking the streets to make sure no sliver of light from a window could help an enemy bomber navigate. They sounded the air raid sirens and made sure people got to shelters. The shelters themselves were a form of civilian ingenuity. Many families had small, steel, Anderson shelters in their backyards, which they often decorated and made as comfortable as possible. public shelters were set up in the tunnels of the London Underground, where thousands of people would sleep every night during the Blitz. After the bombs fell, the real work of the ARP began. The volunteer firefighters of the Auxiliary Fire Service would battle the blazes that engulfed entire city blocks. The rescue squads, often made up of men from the building trades, would tunnel into the rubble of collapsed buildings searching for survivors. This was incredibly dangerous work. They were often working while the raid was still going on, with more bombs falling around them. The scale of this volunteer effort was enormous. By 1940, there were more than 1.5 million people serving in the ARP and other civil defense services in Britain. Their story is one of quiet, methodical courage. They were not trying to win the war in a grand, strategic sense. They were just trying to save their neighbors. They were trying to hold their communities together in the face of unimaginable destruction. This deeply personal street-level view of the war is captured in the diaries and memoirs of the era and analyzed in historical works like The Blitz, The British Under Attack by Juliet Gardiner. This civilian response to bombing was not unique to Britain. In every city that came under air attack, ordinary people developed strategies of survival and resistance. They created informal networks to share food and information. They organized impromptu rescue efforts. They found ways to maintain a sliver of normalcy, to hold a dance in a bomb shelter, to put on a play in the ruins of a theater songs as an act of defiance. They proved that a city is not just a collection of buildings that can be destroyed. It is a network of people, and that network can be incredibly resilient. But even after all these years, questions about this ultimate civilian frontline remain. How did the constant nightly threat of death from the sky psychologically reshape an entire generation of children who grew up in the Blitz? We have statistics on buildings destroyed, but how many countless small acts of bravery and ingenuity by ARP wardens and rescue workers went unrecorded, lost in the noise and fire of the raids? And in an age of precision-guided weapons and cyber warfare, have we forgotten the fundamental lesson of the Blitz, that the ultimate target in any war is the will of the civilian population to endure?